Hey, Corbin here, and these are our concrete countertops that we poured. They look awesome and we're super excited about them. They have a integrated drainboard over here and a custom shape around our granite farmhouse sink. But they're the second one we did because the first one was a brown and we didn't like it. This is a black, turned out awesome, really smooth, and I'm super excited about it. So in this video we're going to talk about how I made it, made the mold, did the pouring. We're going to show some of the brown countertop that we first did, which we don't really like, and end up removing, and also some of the black one. So let's check it out. Let me highlight a few of the cool things we did in the backsplash. First of all, on the right hand side is a fork and spoon that we embedded, and I love this. It just looks awesome, and it kind of fits in with the cooking and eating theme of a kitchen. On the left side, I embedded a wrench and a nut because I just wanted to put a little piece of my own handiwork into there, and I thought it would look really cool to have a crescent wrench embedded in concrete. In the center between the two pieces, there is a piece of copper, and the reason that I cast it in two pieces is to avoid cracking, which I learned by doing it wrong in the first countertop. Let's take a look at the brown countertops that we did first and ended up not using. We didn't use them because we didn't like the brown color. It just didn't fit in. But we also made a few mistakes. I had some cracking and a few other issues, and I want to talk about the problems that I had, and that way you can avoid replicating the problems and do a better first pour. So right here is one of the cracks, and the problem was I left some wood in the mold and it swelled up when I was grinding it and pushed this piece out and cracked it right here. It cracked it here, and there's a crack down my integrated drain too. The brown countertops have been getting some fading here for some reason. I think that the finish, I didn't let it dry long enough or cure long enough, and so the constant water contact has been making it fade, even though these countertops have only been here about a week or 2 weeks. The backsplash also cracked in the middle because it was really a long, thin piece and it was just too thin. So in the next version of the casting, I'm going to do it into two parts and have a separator here in the middle to avoid a center crack. The aggregate that we add to it, you can see it, a lot of it showed through, but the problems that we had is the aggregate actually left lots of air bubbles around, and the air bubbles we had to fill in with brown slurry, and it didn't turn out just as smooth or as nice as we wanted because the aggregate just let air kind of sit into it. The large flat area also didn't get a lot of aggregate up at the top because it needed to be glued down. The aggregate should have been glued down to the mold, and so it ended up having it just dispersed, and you don't see a lot of it, hardly at all, and it really wasn't the look we were going for. The backsplash got some cracks. These parts were a little bit too thin, and so they cracked, and I just tested, broke them off after they got cracked just to see how thin and fragile it was. The problem is it was just too thin even for the DFRC, the fiber reinforced concrete, and so the way I'm going to solve this in the next casting is to put a piece of rebar in the back here, which should make it a lot stronger. Okay, the first thing to do is to create a mold for the countertop, and I have it modeled up in Sketchup, and I just drew a mold around the countertop, and we're going to cast it upside down. So to get a better feel for what I'm going to make, I flip it upside down, and then I can go ahead and unhide the actual countertop and see the mold that we need to create. The mold is going to be made out of 3/4 inch melamine that I got from Home Depot, and I use my track saw to cut it into smaller pieces. It's super heavy, so I just dragged it out directly from my truck onto some sawhorses, and I cut it with the track saw and totally messed up to support it right and just didn't work so well. I used my track saw to cut the inside corners for the sink cutout, and I got as close as I could to the corner and would stop short of it, I did overshoot in a few spots, and I'll show you how I addressed that later in the video. Once I did that, I grabbed the jigsaw and cut it free using the jigsaw. I also used the track saw for the angle in the backside of the countertop. It was pretty easy, and I just matched it for the adjacent side. Note that I would use the table saw to create some nice parallel edges. I would just do it when the pieces were cut to smaller size so I could more easily manage them. I needed a table to do the pour on, so this is just a 3/4 inch piece of plywood with some 2x4s screwed onto the bottom and put on 2 or 3 sawhorses. I set the mold bottom on the plywood, and at this point it's time to start leveling things. There are several reasons to level the table. You want it to be level so the concrete doesn't pour over the edges, and if it's not level, it will likely be twisted, and the twist will show up in your finished concrete slab. So I level it, and I just grab some shims and shim underneath the table above the sawhorses until it's level. Once the table is level, I started working on the sides. They are 3/4 of an inch taller than the depth of the countertop, that way to accommodate for the bottom of the sheet of melamine. And I just pre-drill and then screw them on with 1¼ inch or 1.5 inch drywall screws. It works pretty well, but if you don't pre-drill, it will tend to crack. If you read some of Chang's concrete books, he suggests building a little mold support like this so that things don't move. It's not absolutely necessary, and I ended up not doing this for the second mold, but it is nice to hold things in place. Particularly, I wanted my sink area to be 100% square, and that way the countertop around the sink was the most perfect and portion of it, because the sides that hang over my countertop don't have to be perfect. Hopefully that makes sense. One large countertop would be too heavy to move and could risk cracking, so I cast it into 2 pieces and simply put a separator in between it at a particular location, sort of to the left of where my faucet would be. And I made this out of 1/8 inch aluminum, and so I'm just marking out where I want it to be, and I went ahead and cut it out. I made the aluminum separator just slightly taller, and then used my track saw to cut just a really thin groove where the separator needs to be in both the pieces, and then it could kind of set in the groove and not move around. For the round corners, I just used some drain pipe. I cut a piece out with my bandsaw, and then I took it over to the sander and just sanded them until they were basically flush and fit nicely in the locations that I wanted them to be. Once I had the corners ready, I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy, spread some on the edges of the corners, and just glued them on in. I had a couple of clamps to hold it tight, and left it until it dried. After they were dry, I sanded them down to be a little bit flush and made it so it was smooth. If it was rough in any way, I used some Bondo to kind of ease the corners in a little bit better. For the integrated disc drain area, I wanted it to go from about 1/8 inch down up to, I don't know, 1/2 inch. So I just made spacers of that width, and then I could grab a piece cut out for that area and drop it on in, and this gave it the proper incline that I wanted to make it drain directly into the sink. The way I did the grooves was to take a piece of alder wood, it could really be whatever wood you have on stock, and I planed it down to 1/2 inch thick. This is the width of the grooves that I desired, and after I planed it down to 1/2 inch thick, I took it over the table saw and I ripped 1/8 inch thick pieces off of it, because that's the depth that I want for the grooves. I could then take those and scuff up the melamine and glue them in place with some 5-minute epoxy. Once the glue dried, I sanded them smooth, and then I just took some spray varnish and a glossy one and then sprayed it on. I think I did 2 or 3 coats, and the reason I did this is because I don't want the concrete to stick to this, and this technique worked pretty well to prevent the concrete from sticking. Next, I needed to create a mold for the backsplash. So it's just a simple square, but I need some knockouts for the outlets that I want to install. So I just made some square pieces and covered them with some clear tape, clear packing tape, so the concrete wouldn't stick to it, and then screwed them on down. So I wanted to have some cool backsplash accents. I went ahead and grabbed an old crescent wrench and heated it up until it was red hot with my oxyacetylene torch. Then I grabbed it after it was cold and walked it over to my milling machine. The annealing made it soft so that I could go ahead and mill it down. If I dropped it in the mold as is, you wouldn't really see much of a wrench. It needed to be flat. And so I took it to the mill, stuck a big end mill in it, and just milled it until it was flat on one side. I did this twice, once for each countertop, and I realized it was actually easier if I welded the lower jaw of the crescent wrench together first, and so it wouldn't move and fall apart before I started machining it. My setup's a little janky, but it kind of worked, and I did get it to the state that I wanted. The mill left a little roughness on the wrench, so the flat side I just took and pushed it against my belt sander to kind of get smooth and have a nice finish. After that, I rubbed a little bit of black silicone onto it, and then I could just kind of like glue it in with this at the location I wanted, and this worked pretty well. So I asked my wife Lexi what would be cool to put into the countertop inside a kitchen, and she's like, well, something related to cooking, like a measuring cup or fork and spoon. And the fork and spoon was an awesome idea. So I grabbed some stainless steel fork and spoons, put them on my anvil, heated them up until they were red hot with the torch, and then pounded them flat so I could drop them into the mold. I did this countertop twice, and the first fork and spoons, they didn't really set really well and pulled out with the mold. And so the second ones, I decided to weld on a little back to the fork and spoon. And so I just went and grabbed some square stock I had laying around, bent it, and then welded it to the back of the fork and the spoons to give the concrete something to attach to. I rubbed a little bit of silicone on the back of the fork and spoon and used that to glue them on into the mold. And this worked pretty well, and I was pretty happy with this technique. So I use fiber reinforced concrete. DFRC is the particular type that I'm using from Concrete Exchange. And you don't need it to be the full thickness of concrete countertops. Usually like 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick is what you would normally do with some rebar inside of it for strength. So in other words, you have steel rebar and forced concrete. You don't need to do that if you're using DFRC. And so instead you can actually make it just like 1 inch thick. And so what you can do is you can create an inner mold that will have the outer portion be the thickness you want. In my case, I made it 1 7/8 of an inch thick, and the inner side can be 1 inch thick. This gives you a lighter countertop, and it's much easier to move around. You also don't need as much concrete, so it saves you some money, particularly when you're using DFRC, which is rather pricey compared to cheap concrete like Sacrete 2000 that you can buy at just Home Depot. So I created an inner mold. I put some packing tape on the bottom of it so that it wouldn't stick to the concrete, and then I screwed some top pieces onto it to hold the inner mold where I want it to be on the inside when I poured the concrete. The nice thing about using DFRC concrete is it has a very uniform look. It doesn't have any aggregate in it other than the fiber, so you can add your own aggregate that you want to show up. And so Lexi and I tossed aggregate in the first countertop we did and kind of tried to like glue it down a little bit with some stickiness and put it where we wanted and hope that this would show up. And this didn't really work, and I don't really recommend doing this technique. I would probably just take my contact cement spray that I have, or spray adhesive, spray it on the mold, and then just drop your pieces down and then they'll stick to the bottom. The problem I had is I dropped the concrete in and it floated the little pieces up, and it didn't really appear the way I wanted it to appear. And that's one of the reasons that we actually did this again. So I bought a cheap concrete mixer from Craigslist. It was like 40 or 60 bucks. And the first thing I do is I want to drop in the DFRC admix, the liquid. It's all pre-measured. It's just a gallon and it's really simple. You drop it in, and then after you put that in, you can add the colorant. And the first countertop we did was brown and the second was black. You just add the colorant to it and let it stir around for a little bit. And then you can pour in the concrete slowly to let it mix. So let me talk about pouring. I've done a few concrete countertops at this point, and what I'm doing here is pouring the first one for my kitchen, the brown countertop that we ended up not using. And in the second countertop, we added a cup or a cup and a half of water to the mix, and this made it a little bit more liquidy and flowed a lot better and made it have less air bubbles in the actual countertop, and that means you have less holes that you have to fill up. And we practically had no holes. It was pretty awesome for the second one. For the first one, I wish I would have added a cup or cup and a half of water. You can add up 2 cups per bag and it will totally be fine. And we didn't do this. Instead, we just added the normal amount of admix and then kind of spooned it in and spread it out. One thing I forgot to do in the first countertop is you want to spread up onto the edges. We didn't do that, and because we didn't do that, you could actually see a little bit of a layer in the brown countertop on the edges. So you kind of want to work its way up to the edge. After you have about an inch in the mold, you need to go ahead and pound the bottom. And this part is essential, especially if you don't have a concrete shaker or some tool to automatically do this, which the pros have. And I would just use a hammer and go underneath and pound the heck out of the underneath of the mold and kind of pat it on the top. And the goal here is to remove any air bubbles and any gaps that you have in the mold. And one of the things that we discovered is having another cup of water or a cup and a half of water would make it eliminate a lot of the holes that would be left in the mold or the bottom. And just pounding and having the more liquid mix worked really well for the second one we did. The first one we didn't actually have it liquidy enough, and this didn't work too well at all. So once we had about an inch of concrete in, I went ahead and screwed the inner mold in, and then we could start filling the edges up of the inner mold all the way up to the top or bottom of the mold, however you're looking at it. The top if it's upside down like it is here, or the bottom if it was actually flipped over the way it's going to be installed. So I'm flipping over to the black countertop that shows the inner mold with about an inch thick and the outer edges, which are much thicker, the full thickness that we want it to be. I let the concrete dry overnight. I think it was really only about 8 to 12 hours. The DFRC doesn't need to be in the mold too long, and actually if you leave it in the mold longer than you should, it starts to get something called curling. I think I actually ended up getting curling, and I'll talk about that later, and that happened after it was out of the mold already. But whatever, here I am taking it out of the mold. It's really cool to kind of just see it pop out and see what it looks like. So here I am removing the inner mold. It can be tricky to remove sometimes if it's embedded deeply in the concrete, and so I'll just use a crowbar or a hammer or something to kind of help assist and pop it out. And that works pretty well. You don't really want to stress it too much because it is fresh and raw concrete. So here I'm using a technique of screwing a screw into the inner mold and then putting the crowbar on that screw to use to assist in prying the inner mold out. This technique worked pretty well. You just kind of screw some screws in, pry it on up, and pull that inner mold on out. It worked pretty darn well. To emphasize that point a little bit more, here I'm pulling the inner mold out, and as I pull it up, the pieces just snap off, which isn't a big deal. So I pull it up, it kind of tries to make its way out, and then it snaps off. And so shoot, what do? So I just grab a drywall screw. I screw it on into that point that is snapped off, and what that's going to do, it's going to give me a place to kind of pry out and get the inner mold out. So I grab my crowbar. Sometimes I'll stick a piece of wood under it to get more leverage, and then use that to give me the leverage to break the inner mold on up and get on out. Once the inner mold is out, I can work on the outer mold, and I just go ahead and unscrew it and kind of just peel it away and start to see the edges that I've created and see how they look. Here are a few shots of the round corners that I created with the pipe. They look awesome. You can see a little bit of Bondo that kind of stuck to the concrete, but it sands off pretty darn easily. Once I get all the edge pieces off of the mold, I go ahead and flip them upside down, or right side up actually, because the top was on the bottom of the mold, and then I can pry these pieces off. The side that was flat without the integrated drain board was pretty easy to pop off. Really the only thing holding it on was a little bit of silicone from the corners, and I just forced it on and off. The side with the integrated drain board also popped off pretty easily, but the drain board was left on, which is kind of what I expected. Now the drain board was a lot trickier to get off. What I find worked best was to create a few wedges and to just start hammering the wedges in between the drain board and kind of just easing it up bit by bit. So I would hammer one in, another in, and a third in, and then just kind of rotate them from one slot to another until it would just ease up gently one bit at a time. You don't want to force it up too rapidly because it will probably pull a little bits of the concrete on up with it. So I just kind of went gentle and did one piece at a time, and eventually it did pop on off without any problems. The demolding of the Backsplash was pretty similar, but one thing I did do first was to unscrew the knockouts that I had made for my outlets. If I didn't do this, and I forgot to do it in one of the spots in my first countertop Backsplash, and what happened is when I pulled the mold up, the screwed in spot was just stuck to the bottom and ended up making the Backsplash crack. So don't forget to unscrew it before you actually pull stuff apart. This is what the crescent wrench and the nut and the fork and spoon look like when they were directly pulled out of the mold. Not a problem, we will grind them out later to make it so you can see them. So my next step was to move the countertops outside so I can do some wet grinding and wet polishing and get them to be the finish that I wanted to have. The brown countertops looked really gray when they were dry, and let me illustrate a problem I had. I left a piece of the wood mold inside the inner concrete because I couldn't really get it out, and it expanded after it got wet when I was grinding, and the expansion moved the concrete and cracked the concrete. So this was a bummer. Don't leave any wood mold bits in your concrete when you're grinding. After you grind to I think about 400 grit, you need to do a slurry fill. Depending on the color you use, you may have a pre-mixed slurry, or else you have to mix your own. Just be sure to get the ratios right so that it blends in really well. And you mix the slurry up, you want the countertops to be wet, and then you just use you use something to kind of just smooth the slurry on into it and leave it just slightly proud. The slurry is super easy to sand off or to grind off about a day later. So the whole point of this slurry is to remove any pinholes or gaps or voids that you have in the countertop. And I would usually do about 2, maybe 3 coats of slurry, depending on how bad it is, to get rid of all those holes. The second pour we did turned out to be awesome and really just needed 1 coat of slurry, and that was it. We pounded it really well. We used a more liquid mix, and it turned out pretty nice. After we slurry it, and it's dried and polished again, up to I think about 400 grit, we go ahead and take it and just wipe it off and wet it a little bit. the next step is to put the concrete sealer on. The concrete sealer is a 2-part mix, so you mix it as per the instructions, and then you dilute it a bit, and then you just pour it on. This diluted mix you pour on and use a roller to roll it out. I'm just following the directions that I found on the internet. It's pretty darn easy to do. So I put 3 coats of the sealer on. I found that 2 coats just wasn't enough and would wear away too fast. 3 coats seems to be adequate, but it does show some scratches if you drag things on it. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how these countertops turned out.